I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The drive up to Lake Clearwater was always a ritual of decompression for me. 3 hours of watching the city fade in my rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills, and eventually the glittering water that had been my childhood playground. My father had built the cabin himself back in the 80s, before developers discovered the area, before the mansions started sprouting along the shoreline, before the homeowners association decided they owned the view. I rounded the final curve, expecting to see the familiar weathered blue cabin nestled between the pines. Instead, I hit the brakes so hard my seatbelt locked. Where the cabin should have been stood a blackened skeleton, twisted metal, collapsed roof, the charred remains of what once was our family sanctuary. My father was sitting on an overturned boat near the water's edge. He did not turn when I approached. He did not need to. He knew my footsteps. I stood beside him, unable to process what I was seeing. "Dad," I said, my voice barely audible over the gentle lapping of water against the shore. "What happened?" He looked up at me with eyes that had aged a decade in what must have been days. "It happened 2 nights ago," he said, his voice hollow. "I was in town getting supplies, came back to this." I surveyed the destruction. 20 years as a fire investigator had taught me to read ruins like others read books. This was not accidental, not with that burn pattern, not with that distinctive chemical smell still lingering. "The police?" I asked. My father gave a bitter laugh. "They came, took some photos, said it looked electrical and left." I felt my professional instincts kicking in but kept my face neutral. "And you believe that?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a laminated paper in a plastic sleeve. "This was left on my dock the morning before the fire." The letterhead displayed the Lake Clearwater Homeowners Association logo. Bold red letters spelled out "Final Notice of Violation." Below, clinical language outlined unauthorized modifications, non-compliant structures, and immediate enforcement action. I read it twice, feeling heat rise in my chest that had nothing to do with the sun overhead. "How long has this been going on?" "Years," my father said, looking back toward the water. "Started small, paint color citations, complaints about my dock, the flagpole I put up after your mother died. I ignored them. Then the fines started, then the threats." A neighbor walked by on the shore path, eyes darting to the ruins, then quickly away when she noticed us watching. Her pace quickened. "The neighbors?" I asked quietly. "Scared," my father replied. "The HOA board runs this place like their personal kingdom. Most people just pay the fines and fall in line." I took one more look at the destruction, at my father's defeated posture. Something cold and determined settled in my stomach. "Who is on this board?" I asked. My father listed names I committed instantly to memory. Names that would soon learn the meaning of consequences. "They do not know what you do for a living, do they?" my father asked, a hint of his old sharpness returning. I shook my head slowly, my hand unconsciously touching the state fire marshal badge in my pocket. "No," I said quietly, "and for now let us keep it that way." My father and I moved to a small motel in town that evening. Over dinner at the local diner, he unfolded the full history of his war with the Homeowners Association. Each detail made my blood pressure rise, but I kept my face neutral, asking careful questions between bites of food I could barely taste. "It started 5 years ago," he explained, pushing his untouched meatloaf around his plate. "New board took over. Suddenly there were inspections, citations, rules nobody had heard of before. The cabin had stood for nearly 30 years without issue. Then came the letters. The blue paint was no longer an approved color. The dock extended 3 inches beyond regulation length. The bird feeder attracted non-indigenous species. The flagpole we had installed after my mother's funeral was an unauthorized vertical structure. "I told them to go to hell," my father said, a flicker of his old defiance showing through. "This was my land before they ever showed up with their rule books." His resistance only intensified their focus. When he stopped attending their meetings, the fines increased. When he refused to pay, they threatened liens against his property. When he filed complaints with the county, those papers mysteriously disappeared. Last month, they issued an ultimatum. my father said, finally pushing his plate away. Either bring everything up to code within 30 days or face maximum enforcement. I thought they meant legal action. I studied my father's face, the new lines around his eyes, the defeated slope of his shoulders. This proud man who had taught me to stand up for what is right had been systematically broken down by petty tyrants with clipboards and bylaws. "Did you keep records?" I asked. "The citations, the correspondence?" He nodded, every last piece of paper. "I may be stubborn, but I am not stupid." "And the final warning, the one before the fire, what exactly did it say?" My father's eyes darkened. That non-compliant structures would be removed and that I would bear full financial responsibility for any necessary enforcement actions. I set down my fork with a deliberate calm that belied the fury building inside me. "Show me everything," I said. "Every letter, every photo, every record of every interaction." Back in the motel room, my father pulled out a weathered accordion file. Inside was a meticulously documented history of harassment. Citations for grass being a quarter-inch too tall. Fines for having 4 chairs on his dock instead of the permitted 3. A reprimand for installing solar lights along his walkway without prior approval. I spread the papers across the bed, creating a timeline. The escalation was clear, systematic, deliberate. "Who is behind this?" I asked. "Who leads the board?" "Richard Kessler," my father said, the name coming out like something bitter on his tongue. "Retired corporate lawyer, moved here 5 years ago, built that monstrosity on the North Shore. Within 6 months, he was HOA president." I wrote down the name, then the names of the other board members, then the specific violations that had escalated in the weeks before the fire. "I am going to need to look at the site again tomorrow," I said, "alone with my equipment." My father looked at me, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You are not just here as my daughter anymore, are you?" I met his gaze steadily. "I am here as exactly who I am, Dad, the state fire marshal, and if what I suspect is true, those people just committed a serious felony." I returned to the cabin site before dawn, dressed in jeans and a windbreaker that concealed my official gear. The morning mist hung over the lake, shrouding what remained of the structure in an ethereal gray light. Perfect conditions for what I needed to do. 20 years of investigating fires had taught me that evidence speaks its own language. Burn patterns tell stories. Char depths reveal timelines. Chemical traces whisper secrets. And the ashes of my father's cabin had many stories to tell. I pulled my kit from the car and began a methodical examination. The local fire department had listed the cause as electrical, supposedly an outlet on the east wall of the living room. But as I moved through the ruins, the evidence told a completely different story. The deepest char patterns were on the exterior porch, not the interior wall. The burn signatures moved from outside in, not inside out. Near what remained of the porch steps, I detected the unmistakable odor that only certain accelerants leave behind. I took samples from multiple locations, carefully bagging and labeling each one. I photographed the burn patterns from every angle, documenting the clear evidence that contradicted the official report. The fire had not started from an electrical outlet. It had been deliberately set on the porch, with accelerant trailed along the wooden siding and toward the propane tank that serviced the cabin. Had the flames reached that tank, my father might not have survived if he had been home. The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. As I worked, a county sheriff's patrol car pulled up. The deputy approached cautiously. "Ma'am," he called out, "this is a restricted area." I straightened and turned to face him, keeping my expression neutral. "I am a relative of the owner," I said, which was true enough. "Just collecting some personal items that might have survived." He looked skeptical, eyeing my collection bags and camera. "Those do not look like personal items." I made a decision in that moment. I pulled out my badge and ID. "State Fire Marshal's office. I am conducting a secondary investigation." His expression shifted from suspicion to surprise, then to something like discomfort. "We already filed our report on this incident. Electrical failure in the main structure." "I have seen the report," I said, keeping my tone professional. There are inconsistencies I need to address. Inconsistencies? He echoed, suddenly defensive. I gestured to the burn patterns. The point of origin listed in your report is inconsistent with the physical evidence. The deepest char is exterior, not interior, and there is clear evidence of accelerant use. The deputy shifted his weight, not meeting my eyes. I will need to inform my superior about this reinvestigation. Please do, I replied calmly. Also inform them that I will be requesting all original incident photos and the full inspection records, today. After he left, I continued my work with even greater thoroughness. Every sample, every photograph, every measurement added to the picture forming in my mind. This had not been an accident or an electrical failure. This had been deliberate arson, poorly disguised and hastily dismissed by local authorities. By midday, I had everything I needed to open a formal investigation file. The ashes had spoken clearly. Now it was time to hear what the people responsible had to say for themselves. The Lake Clearwater Homeowners Association held its monthly meetings in the community center, a modern glass and stone building that stood in stark contrast to the rustic cabins it governed. I arrived early, dressed in casual clothes, a notebook in hand, and took a seat in the back row. My father had given me his proxy vote document, identifying me only as family representative. The room filled gradually with residents, some inexpensive resort wear, others in the practical clothing of people who actually lived on the lake year-round. The division was visible in where they sat, how they greeted each other, the confidence or trepidation in their postures. At precisely 7 o'clock, 5 people entered and took seats at the front table. Richard Kessler, the president, sat center, flanked by his executive board. He was exactly as my father had described, tall, silver-haired, with the practiced smile of someone used to getting his way. "Let us call this meeting to order," he announced, tapping a gavel with theatrical authority. "First item, approval of minutes from last month." I studied each board member as the mundane business proceeded. The treasurer, Barbara Whitfield, a thin woman with a permanent pinched expression. The secretary, Michael Dolan, younger than the others, constantly checking his phone. The 2 at-large members, Thomas Reeves, a retired banker with an aggressive handshake, and Carolyn Mayers, who smiled too much and made too little eye contact. I recorded names, voices, mannerisms. I noted who deferred to whom, who seemed enthusiastic about enforcement, who simply followed along. I was building profiles, the way I did at every fire scene. Understanding the human elements was often as important as the physical evidence. The meeting progressed through budget reports and landscaping proposals. Then came enforcement actions. Item 7, Kessler announced, satisfaction evident in his tone. Resolution of the North Shore noncompliance issue. My pen stilled over my notebook. My father's cabin had been on the North Shore. Barbara Whitfield spoke up, her voice precise and cold. "I am pleased to report that the long-standing violation at Lot 37 has been resolved. The non-compliant structure has been removed." Removed, not burned, not destroyed. Removed as if they had simply taken down an unapproved fence. Thomas Reeves chuckled, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. Shame it took so long. That eyesore was affecting property values for years. The owner was given ample opportunity to comply, Kessler added smoothly. His continued defiance left us no choice but to enforce our bylaws. I felt heat rising in my face but kept my expression neutral, my breathing steady. On my phone, recording discreetly in my lap, every word was being captured. During the open comment period, I raised my hand. Kessler acknowledged me with the dismissive nod he seemed to reserve for unfamiliar faces. "Yes, the proxy representative from Lot 37, correct." "That is correct," I said, standing. "I have a question about fire safety protocols for the association." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or wariness crossed his features. "Fire safety." "Yes," I continued. "Given recent events, I am curious about the association's emergency response procedures. Does the HOA have a specific protocol for fire incidents? and who conducts inspections of common areas for fire hazards. Kessler cleared his throat. We follow all county regulations, of course. The community center has regular inspections. And private residences. That would be the responsibility of individual owners, he replied, his tone suggesting the matter was closed. Interesting, I said. And if the association identifies what it considers a fire hazard on private property? Michael Dolan shifted uncomfortably. Barbara Whitfield's expression hardened. Kessler's smile never wavered. We issue citations through our normal enforcement channels, he said. Safety is a priority for this community. I nodded as if satisfied and sat down. The meeting continued, but I had what I needed. Names, voices, and most importantly, motive captured in their own words. As the meeting concluded, I lingered, watching the board members gather their materials. Carolyn Mayers approached me, her practiced smile in place. I do not believe we have met, she said, extending her hand. Carolyn Mayers, welcome to Clearwater. I shook her hand, nodding the expensive jewelry, the careful manicure. Thank you. I am just here temporarily helping family. Lot 37, she said, her smile unchanging but her eyes hardening slightly. Such an unfortunate situation. Had your relatives simply followed the rules, it all could have been avoided. Which rules exactly were being violated? I asked innocently. Her smile tightened. Oh, numerous infractions over many years. The board tried to be patient, but eventually enforcement became necessary. Enforcement, I repeated, letting the word hang between us. Such as... She blinked, then glanced toward Kessler, who was watching our interaction with poorly concealed interest. You should review the association bylaws, she said briskly. Everything was done according to procedure. I smiled. I will definitely be reviewing all the procedures, I promised, very thoroughly. As I walked to my car, I called the county legal office. This is State Fire Marshal Reynolds, I said when my contact answered. I need to initiate an arson investigation with multiple suspects, and I need it kept quiet until we have everything in place. The investigation moved with the controlled burn of a backfire, methodical, purposeful, contained. I submitted my preliminary findings to the county's fire investigation unit, requesting a formal probe while emphasizing the need for discretion. Within days, a small team was assembled, operating from a temporary office in the county building rather than on site at the lake. The samples tested positive for accelerant, my colleague Marcus reported, sliding a lab report across the desk. Specifically, a mixture of gasoline and diesel, commonly used because it burns slower, hotter, and is harder to extinguish. I nodded, adding the report to our growing file. Consistent with the burn patterns I documented, what about the original fire department photos? Marcus grimaced. Interesting situation there. The originals were accidentally deleted, according to the local department, but one of the volunteers had backed them up on his personal device. He brought up the images on his tablet. The photos clearly showed what I had observed, burn patterns inconsistent with an electrical fire, clear pour patterns on the exterior, evidence of multiple ignition points. Somebody didn't want these pictures seen, I said, scrolling through them. What about the surveillance? This had been our breakthrough. During canvassing, we discovered that a neighbor 3 lots down had installed a security camera system that covered part of the shoreline path. With a warrant, we obtained footage from the night of the fire. The timestamp showed 11:42 p.m. A figure moved along the path, stopping at my father's dock. Even in the grainy night vision, the distinctive jacket was recognizable, the same North Face jacket Thomas Reeves had worn to the HOA meeting. He carried something bulky. He disappeared from frame for 17 minutes. When he reappeared, his hands were empty and he was moving much faster. We have interviews scheduled with 5 neighbors today, Marcus said. Several indicated they have information but were afraid to come forward initially. Those interviews proved illuminating. Multiple residents described years of escalating HOA harassment against my father. One woman tearfully admitted witnessing board members on my father's property the day before the fire, taking photos and arguing loudly. They said they were going to take care of the problem once and for all, she recounted. I should have said something sooner, but my husband is sick, and we cannot afford to fight them if they turned on us next. Meanwhile, our digital forensics team had been busy. Although the HOA had mysteriously lost certain records when initially questioned, their email server and cloud storage told a different story. Look at this email chain, my digital specialist said, highlighting a conversation between board members from 3 days before the fire. Subject line, cabin resolution, final plan. The emails detailed a meeting at Kessler's home to discuss permanent solutions to the North Shore problem. Attendees included Reeves, Whitfield, and Dahlan. The language was careful coded, but the intent was clear, especially when read alongside the HOA financial records showing a cash withdrawal of $500 the day before the fire, categorized vaguely as emergency maintenance supplies. By the end of the week, we had assembled a case solid enough to present to the district attorney. The evidence was damning. Forensic proof of arson, surveillance footage, witness statements, documentary evidence of motive, threatening communications, and financial transactions supporting the conspiracy timeline. The DA reviewed our findings in a closed-door meeting. This is not just arson, she said, looking up from the file. This is conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and given the propane tank's proximity, attempted murder. I nodded, maintaining professional composure despite the personal stake. We believe there was intentional coordination between at least 3 board members, with the potential knowledge or involvement of others. The local authorities, she asked. At minimum, negligent in their investigation, I replied. At worst, complicit in covering it up. We have requested a separate investigation into potential obstruction charges. She closed the file decisively. We will move forward with arrests and search warrants. Given the risk of evidence tampering we have already seen, I want this executed simultaneously. The warrants were issued discreetly. Teams were assembled. And on a quiet Tuesday morning, while the HOA board was conveniently gathered for their executive session, law enforcement moved in. I stood back, watching as Kessler, Reeves, and Dahlan were led out in handcuffs, their faces registering first indignation, then shock, and finally fear as the charges were read. Whitfield and Mayers were detained for questioning. As Kessler was placed in the police cruiser, his eyes found mine. Recognition dawned slowly on his face. The quiet observer from the back of the meeting, now standing beside the fire marshal's vehicle, badge visible on my belt. His expression of dawning horror was the first moment of satisfaction I had felt since seeing my father's burned cabin. But it was only the beginning. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity on the first day of trial. Residents from Lake Clearwater occupied most seats, a visible divide between those who had benefited from the HOA's regime and those who had suffered under it. My father sat in the front row, his posture straight but hands tightly clasped in his lap. Richard Kessler, Thomas Reeves, and Michael Dahlan sat at the defense table in matching dark suits that could not hide their diminished stature. Without their gavels and bylaws, they looked smaller, ordinary men facing extraordinary consequences. The district attorney laid out the case methodically. This is not a story about rule enforcement, she began. This is a story about power, abuse, and a group of individuals who believed they were above the law. I watched the jury as evidence was presented day after day. They saw the forensic proof of accelerant use. They watched the surveillance footage. They heard the recorded HOA meeting where the defendants had smugly celebrated the removal of my father's cabin. They read the emails outlining the final solution to the North Shore problem. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the stand in my full-state fire marshal uniform. I felt Kessler's eyes following me, hatred and fear mingling in his gaze. Marshal Reynolds, the DA began, please explain to the jury what your investigation revealed about the origin of the fire at Lot 37 on Lake Clearwater. I presented the evidence as I had countless times in other cases, clear, factual, scientific. I explained burn patterns, accelerant traces, point of origin analysis. I walked through the timeline established by the evidence, correlating it with the defendant's known movements and communications. Based on your professional expertise, the DA asked, what is your conclusion regarding the cause of this fire? This was a deliberately set fire, I stated firmly. Multiple ignition points were established using a mixture of accelerants. The fire was set on the exterior of the structure, specifically designed to maximize damage while disguising the criminal nature of the act. During cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to suggest alternative explanations, potential accidents, investigative oversights. I addressed each theory with professional patience, referring back to the evidence. Is it not true, the attorney asked with a hint of desperation, that your personal connection to this case might have influenced your findings? I met his gaze steadily. My relationship to the victim required me to be even more thorough, more precise, and more objective than usual. Every finding in my report has been independently verified by multiple experts. The evidence speaks for itself. The trial continued for 8 days. Neighbors testified about years of HOA harassment. Digital forensics experts walked through the damning email trails. Financial records showed suspicious transactions coinciding with the timeline of the fire. Kessler took the stand in his own defense, attempting to portray himself as a dedicated community servant, merely enforcing agreed-upon rules. His carefully constructed facade crumbled under cross-examination when confronted with his own words from emails and recorded meetings. Did you not state, Mr. Kessler, the DA asked, reading from a transcript, that you would make an example of anyone who defied the board's authority? His face flushed. That was taken out of context. And did you not withdraw $500 in cash the day before the fire for what you called emergency maintenance supplies? That was for legitimate association business. Yet no receipts were ever filed, were they? And this withdrawal was never formally approved by the full board, was it? As closing arguments approached, the defense grew increasingly desperate, eventually attempting to shift blame entirely to Reeves, portraying him as a rogue actor. This strategy backfired when Reeves, feeling betrayed, agreed to testify against Kessler in exchange for consideration in sentencing. On the final day, the judge addressed the jury with careful instructions about the law regarding arson, conspiracy, and the standards of proof. My father squeezed my hand as we waited for deliberations to begin. The jury returned after just 4 hours. The courtroom fell silent as the verdicts were read. On the count of first-degree arson, we find the defendant Richard Kessler guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit arson, we find the defendant Richard Kessler guilty. The litany continued through all charges, all defendants. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The judge's sentencing statement was pointed and severe. The court views these crimes with particular gravity, he said, looking directly at the defendants. You abused positions of trust. You used rules meant to protect a community as weapons to terrorize it. You destroyed not just property, but a family's heritage, history, and security. He sentenced Kessler to 12 years in state prison. Reeves received 8 years due to his eventual cooperation. Dahlan, who had played a smaller role, received 5 years. All were ordered to pay substantial restitution. As the defendants were led away, my father stood watching, his expression not triumphant but resolute. Justice had been served, but nothing could fully restore what had been taken. 3 months after the trial, I returned to Lake Clearwater for a community gathering unlike any the area had seen before. Where the old HOA meeting hall had been filled with tension and fear, the lakeside pavilion now hummed with conversation and cautious optimism. Residents had voted overwhelmingly to dissolve the homeowners association. In its place, they had established a simple community council with limited powers, transparent processes, and term limits. The old rule book, over 300 pages of restrictions and requirements, had been replaced by a 5-page document focused on safety and conservation. My father had received messages of support from across the country after the story made national news. People sent letters sharing their own HOA nightmares, their own battles against petty tyranny disguised as community standards. More meaningful were the neighbors who had come forward, apologies and helping hands extended. The rebuilding of my father's cabin had become a community project. Weekend work parties had accomplished in weeks what would have taken months alone. I walked the shoreline path, pausing at the spot where my father's new cabin now stood. Similar to the original in spirit but built to modern codes with a wide porch facing the water. The flagpole still stood, my mother's memory honored. Solar lights, previously forbidden, lined the path to the dock. My father emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. We sat on the new porch swing, watching evening descend over the lake. "It is a different kind of quiet now," he said, his voice peaceful. "Not the quiet of fear, just peace." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The residents of Lake Clearwater were learning to be neighbors again, not adversaries. Rules still existed, but they served the community rather than controlling it. "What happens when you go back to work?" he asked. "After being in the spotlight like this?" "I have been offered a position developing training programs," I said, "teaching other investigators how to recognize when fires are being used as weapons of intimidation. It is happening more than people realize." My father nodded slowly. "You took something terrible and found a way to help others with it. Your mother would be proud." As darkness settled, neighbors gathered around a fire pit near the shore, a community marshmallow roast that would have been prohibited under the old regime. Children laughed, adults conversed, and the flames rose safely contained within stone borders. I watched that fire, so different from the one that had destroyed my father's home. This fire brought warmth, not destruction. It united rather than divided. It illuminated faces rather than consuming memories. This was the legacy of what had happened here. Not just justice served, but a community reborn. Not just a cabin rebuilt, but relationships restored. Not just rules reformed, but human dignity reclaimed. As I prepared to leave the next morning, my father walked me to my car. The new cabin stood solid behind him, smoke curling gently from the chimney. "You know," he said, "in all those years of fighting them, I never really thought about what I was fighting for. I just knew I could not let them win." "And now?" I asked. He looked back at the cabin, then out at the neighbors walking the shore path, waving friendly greetings as they passed. "Now I remember. It was never about the rules. It was about having the freedom to belong to a place on your own terms, to be part of something without surrendering who you are." I hugged him goodbye, knowing he would be all right. The fire had taken much from him, but in its aftermath, something stronger had emerged, not just for him, but for everyone who had lived under the shadow of petty power. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the lake shimmering in the morning light. No smoke hung over those waters now, only the promise of a different kind of community rising from the ashes of the old.